So again, my name is Isabel Jeniches. I'm speaking to you today from the homelands of the Pueblo peoples, specifically the Tewa-speaking world and Oke-Owinge Pueblo. As someone who's not indigenous to this place, it's important, I believe, to understand the complex history of this land and to recognize the original people, their stewardship and foundational contributions to this work. So thank you again for joining us today. And with this, I pass it on to Howard Gross, the Assistant Commissioner at the State Land Office.
Thanks, Isabel, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see so many people taking the time for this. On behalf of Commissioner of Public Lands, Stephanie Garcia-Richard, I just want to thank the Healthy Soil Working Group for your efforts to promote sustainable agricultural practices and for inviting us to work with you. We feel like providing venues like this webinar today is really an investment that benefits the New Mexicans who work the land and help sustain the water, the soil, the biodiversity, and the food supply that we all rely on. The Land Office is just really pleased to promote this event and to have state trust land agricultural lessees who are really valuable partners to the Land Office. We could not care for close to 9 million acres of surface land in the state without your efforts. So, our feeling is when you have access to information like this that helps you in your stewardship, everyone benefits, the Land Office, the beneficiaries, and really everyone in the state. So I want to thank Dr. Kate Zeigler and Emily Cornell for taking the time today to share your experience and expertise. We look forward to your presentations and really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, everyone. I find this worthwhile.
Thank you, Howard. It's been a real pleasure to work with you and your great team. So with this, I would like to welcome our speakers. Dr. Kate Zeigler is the owner and senior geologist at Zeigler Geologic Consulting, which is a small woman-owned business in Albuquerque. She was born in Montana and raised in Texas, and she came to New Mexico in '99 to continue her studies in geology, and that's also where she got her PhD from the University of New Mexico. She then went on to become a consulting geologist, providing information about groundwater resources to producers and rural communities. And this is what we'll hear from her more about today. Emily Cornell is the owner of Sol Ranch, a cow-calf grass-fed beef operation just outside of Wagon Mound. And she has a BS in environmental and organismic biology from Fort Lewis College in Durango in Colorado. And now leases part of the family ranch she grew up on, in addition to helping her father with this operation as well. So I look forward to hearing more from her about managing for soil health and her collaborations with scientists and neighbors. So Kate and Emily, thank you so much for being here. Really intriguing, and take it away.
All right, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. Emily, do you want to just go ahead and load the PowerPoint? And
all right, so go ahead, Kate.
Okay, so as Isabel mentioned, I'm a free-range consulting geologist, and my team works with farmers and ranchers in 3 states looking at groundwater resource management. And I would like to give a very quick shout out to the Red Bluff Water Control Authority in Pecos, Texas, who are my current hosts today. Emily?
Okay, so I'm a cattle rancher outside of Wagon Mound, New Mexico, in the northeastern part of the state. And I used to run yearlings after I returned home. Now I have purchased some of my father's genetics, my parents' genetics, and have a grass-fed beef operation that's just getting off the ground this year. Made a little bit difficult by lack of processing in our area right now, as you probably all know. But I really strive to help facilitate these necessary relationships between land managers and the support network like all of you that are here, and I see Katie Micklejohn is on there, who's my grazing consultant. And so there's so many of you. So we'll go ahead and move on here. Okay.
So one of the things that I think is foremost in most of our minds, especially with the way that the weather has been this year with not a lot of rain, not a lot of snow, is understanding water and moisture on the landscape and under the landscape. And I think we're all very familiar with the hydrologic cycle, probably horribly so, because we think about it every minute of every day. But when we think about rain or snow that's falling on that landscape, some of it's going to move off as sheet flow or move into our creeks and streams and move along. But some of that water is going to go downward, and it's going to the soil or into the bedrock. Some returns to the atmosphere through evaporation and evapotranspiration. But as we struggle with a lot of the changes in our weather patterns and bringing soils into their prime, I think it's time now that a lot of us start to band together to really get into the nitty-gritty details of where does the water go when it hits that soil surface and goes downward. So we can watch it sheet flow, we can watch it moving in creeks and rivers, but what's happening once it hits that soil? And so thinking about where does water go when we can't see it anymore? And as I've started networking with more soil scientists, and I should preface right away that I'm a geologist, I'm not a soil scientist. So I do the really under the ground part. But one of the things that's occurred to me in listening to a lot of my soil science colleagues is understanding where water goes when we lose sight of it at that soil interface is really tricky. And it's sort of like when you're trying to fix your plumbing in your house, right? Water never goes where you want it to go, it goes where it wants to go. And so, you know, it's this starting to piece together the real understanding of where that water goes and where is it constrained to go and where can it escape the system, either upwards or downwards. And so from my perspective, I'm coming at this interface, the soil, from the bottom. I'm coming from the bedrock, the aquifers, and working my way up, where someone like Emily is coming at it from the top down, looking at the vegetation and the soil itself. And so I think what we'd like to do today is talk a little bit about some of the challenges of trying to understand this and some of the ways that we can start to partner up to do better at this. Next slide. So from my perspective as a bedrock geologist, one of the things that struck me about groundwater is it's such a precious resource. And for most of New Mexico, we rely on groundwater. We don't have a lot of surface water, but it's invisible. And so when we're trying to think about how much is there, how much am I using, is this source of water replenishing or not replenishing, we can't see it. So we have to measure it with a variety of different data sets to get at that. But we can't just look at it and understand what it's doing. And so we can start to come to grips with our groundwater resources, but every system is complicated, like we just said, when we think about where water goes in the world. And so really understanding that interface, that soil interface, and how is what little surface water we have, how is that precious resource operating as it sinks down? This is where I want to tie my understanding of the underground world of New Mexico, the underscape, with that interface. And so the next slide that I'm going to show is a very simplified version of what we think the aquifer systems look like in Northeast New Mexico, Southeast Colorado. But if you'll notice my little asterisks there, not all groundwater resources are directly connected to the surface. And so just because we have a good year of rain or snow doesn't mean those aquifers are magically going to spring back. And so understanding not only the complications of the underscape, but the complications of that interface, I think that's going to be really critical to finally starting to understand the whole part of that hydrologic cycle out here. Next slide. So this is probably a fairly complicated and busy and maybe mind-numbing figure. For a lot of folks, it certainly makes my brain hurt to think about, and I have to think about it every day. But kind of the point with this slide that I want to make is the underscape, that geology, the bedrock aquifer units are so much more complicated than even I thought when I started working in Northeast New Mexico 10 years ago. And so when we look at all the different things that can influence the geology in an area, there's changes in rock types, both vertically and horizontally. There's old topography that's been filled in by newer things. And I don't even have the volcanoes on here. Northeast New Mexico's got tons of volcanoes, and they kind of really booger things up. So when you put a volcano in the middle of your rocks, it makes a big difference. But the bottom line from my perspective, coming from the bottom up, is it's a complicated enough system, even with something like bedrock geology that doesn't change very much, that we have to be very cognizant of those complications. And so from my perspective, the geology is controlling the groundwater. So where you can farm, where you ranch, where you can't farm, that's controlled by what's going on under the ground. Something else to consider is when we're thinking about groundwater-based agriculture is the well that you're standing at and the well that you're looking at a half a mile away, they may not be hydrologically connected to each other. And so trying to understand this really complicated partition land underscape is one thing, but now let's try to understand how that, to my mind as a geologist, that incredibly thin horizon of soil, it has such a profound impact on where water goes when it hits it. And so starting to link all these things together is incredibly critical at this point. Next slide. So basically, when we think about restoring soil health or helping soils to reach their prime function, and again, I'm not a soil scientist, so this is my broad brush conceptualizing of this from working with soil scientists like Patrick O'Neill, who's frankly one of my heroes. But we want to think about, because we have so little surface water in New Mexico and we are dependent on groundwater, which in most of Northeast New Mexico and Southeast Colorado is not recharging in a human lifespan, we want to think about how can we make the most of the water that we do get. So how can we work on increased infiltration, moisture retention, removing plants that are not helping this equation, salt cedar being a big one. But as I've learned over the last couple years from starting to move my way up through the bedrock to the soil, is it's a really complicated interface and there's a lot that we still need to figure out. But there are ways that we as land managers can start to think about, am I having an impact? Because sometimes it can be so frustrating to feel like I'm doing all the right things, but I can't really tell if I'm having any impact at all. So why should I keep doing it? Ranches that we've worked with that have worked on restoring soil conditions, including chaining out of juniper, getting rid of salt cedar, working with rotational grazing techniques to bring ground cover back. One of the things that we see that's an awesome indicator is old seeps and springs start to come back. The perennial pools along creeks, they don't dry up as much in the summer as they used to. And for some of our shallow wells, sometimes we'll start to see some changes in the water table that might be starting to reflect little changes on the land surface. And it's things like, and Emily will speak more to this, but looking at how does that grass landscape look from year to year as you work with it and as you change it. Next slide.
Oh, I think I just wanted to quickly add here on this that in the picture you can see there's a caliche layer, that white layer, and when we're talking about the soil, we know that the varying amounts of clay, loam, and sand components, as well as the parent material, determine so much of that overall functionality of the soil in terms of what lives above and below the soil surface. And like Kate was talking about, how that water behaves when it rains, whether it's going to actually infiltrate or run off. And in New Mexico, that caliche layer kind of it varies so much, you know, in the distance from the soil surface and the overall depth of the layer. And then just it ranges in hardness or induration, I guess the term is called. And that really impacts the depth of our root growth and as well as the water infiltration, because it can, as those of you who have ever dug a post hole in this kind of dirt, you know, when you get to that layer that it can be hard to break through, if at all. And so you can imagine what water is doing or what roots are doing when they encounter that. They kind of come down and then they've got to go sideways if they're going to function at all. And furthermore, the chemistry of this caliche layer really impacts the nutrient availability to your plants because of its basic nature. So it's not acidic, it's basic. And that makes it difficult for things like phosphorus to really be taken up by the plant roots and made available in the plant leaves. And then your livestock can't necessarily get phosphorus. That's something that's definitely limited in our area, and it's highly due to that caliche layer. I'm sure there's more things at play, but so we'll go forward here.
Well, and something to add to what Emily just said is when a soil is first starting to develop, the bedrock geology right at the surface at that time, it can also be a strong control on the minerals that are available as that soil initially begins to build. So whether you have a limestone or a sandstone or a basalt, those are going to be a very fundamental part of that very, very baby soil when it first starts to form. And then of course things change as plants establish and chemical cycles start up. But that the geology, even though it's completely hidden once that soil develops, it's still a big part of the foundation of the different types of soils that we see around New Mexico.
Yeah.
So in many places, what I'm starting to learn is even from the hydrogeologic perspective, most of the counties I work in didn't have any real groundwater data available to them. And this is something that I feel like we're starting to see also with a lot of the soils data, is a super high resolution, really good quality data that we need to really understand. You know, the soils are not the same everywhere. Some ranches can have a million different kinds of soil. Some ranches have just one kind. But our world, our landscape is changing faster than we're able to get scientists and land managers out on the ground doing data collection. And so we're in this horrible race against time to try to understand an incredibly complicated thing well enough to manage properly. And I think it's worth knowing that we can change landscapes in some ways quickly, but overall our landscapes are often really slow to change no matter how much we try to help them. And something that I know Emily and I have talked a lot about in the years that we've worked together is as Northeast New Mexico goes through a seeming never-ending drought, is how are we going to cope now, even if we do get to understanding how moisture moves through the soil, when we don't have moisture to put in the soil, when we have 3 out of 5 years being drought, we don't even have water to put into this potential reservoir. And then we end up with these horrible feedback loops where you have extreme drought, your vegetation dies off, and then we get these short, super intense rains that just tear the heck out of everything. And so these are all these problems that are moving just as fast as we're trying to collect data and understand. And so it's this race to understand these things as the situation changes under our feet. Next slide. So one of the things, and Emily and I discuss this frequently, sometimes at 3 in the morning, and a lot of my landowners that I partner with, from my perspective, and Emily's really going to dig into the vegetation and soil management, but from my perspective, when we're thinking about managing your land, don't forget that invisible resource that's under the ground. A lot of times I think we take for granted that groundwater's there, that well has already flowed, and then one morning we wake up and that well isn't flowing anymore. And so some things to think about are, if you have a shallow well that can recharge quickly, but during 5 years of drought, that well may start to run dry. So if you have other wells that target other aquifer systems, maybe they're not recharging, but they're kind of your backup plan. When you move your cattle, it's expensive at the front end, and we'll talk a little bit more about the financial burdens versus the long-term ecological benefit of some of this. But investing in pipeline and water storage so that you're moving your cattle around instead of one well per pasture, which is also hard on your grass. But having 3 to 4 days of water in a storage tank, so if a well does go down, you have some breathing room there to figure it out. If you don't have cattle in a pasture, turn the well off. It can be as simple as that. It can make a huge difference. Transitioning to solar powered submersible pumps, putting things on timers, using float valves. There's lots of different ways to manage every drop. There are the prices at the front end, but it can be worth it even in just the medium term. And touching very briefly on windmills, they're the icon of the West. My logo is a windmill. They can be a blessing and a curse. And this is something that I heard a lot about in the last 2 years. We all know the spring winds in New Mexico. You got to hold on so you don't end up in West Texas. And so you can have windmills running 24 hours a day, just pouring water out. It's very hard to control that. But the last couple summers in the Wagon Mound area, we didn't get any wind. And it's really hard to get water out of the ground if your windmill's not functioning. But where we have aquifers where the saturated thickness is less than 4 or 5 feet of water, you can't fit a submersible pump in that. It's going to pump down, pump off, not pump at all. Windmills, because of the way the cylinder functions at the bottom of the hole, can actually still eke out a little bit of water from a very small aquifer if that's something that absolutely has to be done. But these are all things to be taking into consideration for the sort of the management of your underscape. Emily?
Yeah. So in addition, this is jumping ahead a little bit in terms of the flow of this, but we have some other resources that we can look at. Really, we as land stewards need to just get a better grasp of our effect on the landscape. Whether we're farming or we have livestock, we just need to understand how those practices impact the soil and our groundwater, and some of the things that you can do as a producer. And you know, technology's huge and it's great and it's wonderful, but I just spent like all morning trying to get my parents hooked up on Zoom, which I see they made it, so that's great. But anyway, we'll throw these out here for those of you who are tech savvy. We've got some apps like Land PKS, which really helps you gain an understanding of the potential of your land. So basically you go out and this app kind of has a series of pictures, and you can say, well, does it look like this or like this? Is the hill slope, you know, is it really steep or is it kind of steep? It's really a very easy tool to sort of work through. And then you end up digging a soil pit and you kind of classify what sort of soil you have based on just, I think it's called the ribbon test. Basically, it's a texture thing that sort of helps you figure out how much clay and how much sand and how much loam you have. And then you can sort of see, it gives you a little report, and it kind of pulls some precipitation, some local like climate data for you to kind of look at based on your GPS coordinate there. That's pretty helpful and free. GrassSnap is another one. I believe it's out of University of Nebraska. This is something that you can use to take photo points, to establish photo points. Basically, it's going to grab your little GPS location. You're going to be able to take the picture, and then you can come back however long later, whether it's, you know, at the end of the season or 5 years later, and you can pull up this picture and then sort of line it up with exactly where it was before. And then it sort of keeps track, and you can do them along a transect, or you can just do sort of a landscape scale. And you don't necessarily need to have like a fence post or something there to mark it. It'll get you back to that same place. I'm not actually familiar with microbiometer. What's this one, Kate?
So this is an interesting little kit that Patrick O'Neill turned me on to, where you go out to a site and you dig a hole and take a bit of your soil out, and you mix it up with they send you this whole kit, and you mix up this little chemical concoction. And it helps you understand your fungus to bacterial ratio in your soil, which is a very important part of sort of your soil biotic diversity. And so it's just a quick and dirty way to look at, are you skewed more towards a bacterial dominated soil versus a fungal dominated soil? I just used it for the first time in September. It was interesting. So throwing that out there for folks to look into as well.
That's kind of neat. Cool. Yeah. And then we have iNaturalist, which I just started to use. And this one allows you to take pictures of plants or bugs or whatever, and you can kind of catalog them, and you take the picture, you upload it, and then it helps you identify it. And then it's kind of in this little bit of a network. So you could like create, like we have one for the ranch. And then we're just sort of cataloging our species, and you can just keep adding, and other people can add too to that same list. But it's really great that you can, then it's there, and someone else who might know more than you can kind of come back in and check your identification. So it kind of has like some pictures that look similar, and you kind of go through that, and you might already have an idea. And then someone back can comment later, yep, think that's right, you know, or not. So that's really helpful for just kind of gathering information about your operation and having a place to put it. Maya Grazing is a really great app. There's a paid version and also a free version. I'd have to go back. I don't remember what all the free version includes, but it allows you to keep records on your herd, and mainly targeting your grazing management. So you have a map with pastures and acreage. You can add in estimations for your forage amounts, like in ADAs or pounds per acre, and it's Australian program, so they've got all their own ways of looking at that, which are different. But this kind of helps you track what you're doing along with your rainfall. Kind of a place, and then there's some forecasting tools that are really useful in terms of being able to plug in what you think. So say you pull some climate data from your nearest weather station and the precip data, and then you can take that and you can say, well, what if we only get 80% of this? Or what if we only get 50% of this? Or what if we get 15% above average? And then you can start to play with numbers and your stocking rates and things like that. And it's just so useful in forecasting and planning. And as soon as I started using it, I was like, oh, okay, I'm overgrazing. And you can see the impact of how long that overgrazing event affects you. And it's really a very useful tool. I've got some great graphs and things. We would have covered that, but we got a lot of things to go over. So there's some more apps like that. I highly recommend photo points. That's the quickest, easiest thing to do is go out and take a picture of something. And then, when you get to it, because we don't want to put producers on some sort of timeline, like you need to do this, this, and this on this timeline. But you can use that photo point and bring it up, go back out there, retake that photo, and just kind of notice the differences. Like you can also kind of compare that to the rainfall that you had that year, or how hard do you think you grazed that. Another just super essential tool is Google Earth. Get on Google Earth and look at your property from above and start to notice just the patterns that you can see, whether that's the trailing along old fence lines, or you can see old fields sometimes. You can see all kinds of amazing things on Google Earth. If you guys have not gotten on, I highly recommend it. It's free, and it gets updated every so often. I think you can also go back in time. So that's helpful to kind of look at like woody encroachment. And then you have your NRCS ecological site descriptions, which if you contact the NRCS, they can help you access that. But you can also get on Web Soil Survey. And again, you sort of delineate an area that you want to look at. And it will bring up so much information, from the types of soils that are there, to infiltration rates, to how well is it suited to farming, depth to the bedrock layer, types of plants that you should see there, so much. And pretty easy to use. There's some little tutorials on their website that kind of help you if you're just not super tech savvy. They can help you work through that. And I think the biggest thing, if you're not doing anything to keep a record of anything on your property, the number one thing you should keep track of is your precipitation. And so I've actually included mine here below in this table. This is not through CoCoRaHS, but CoCoRaHS is sort of like a community science. There are rain gauges on people's properties, houses in town and not across the states. I'm not sure if it extends beyond that, but they send you a really highly accurate rain gauge, which you can see in the bottom left corner, and it's a little bit bigger, and you can see it kind of has a funnel and sort of like an inner tube that's disconnected there. But if that inner tube, which I want to say it goes up to like an inch, and then it kind of overflows into the bigger piece so that you're not missing anything. But this is something that you can, they recommend you update how much precip you get daily, which is a little tedious for someone in New Mexico who goes, months without rain, but you can also do sort of like a multi-day report. But you can see there that it's going to capture, it's a little more accurate than your farmway rain gauge, though that's not bad either. We definitely have a bunch of those out too. So, but keeping track of that precip is just, it's so useful. There's no reason you shouldn't do it as a rancher or farmer. As you can see in there, you can see in 2016 was sort of a somewhat average year. 2017, we had 30 inches of rain. If you go over to August, you can see that we got as much in August as we did almost the year before. And those are those rainfall events that Kate is talking about. Those events that come all at once. I think we had 8 inches in about an hour on what we call Bean Day weekend, which is Labor Day. And it fell up on top on the mesa there, and we have a lot of bedrock, exposed bedrock, and the head cuts and the fallout from that. I mean, it washed out the road, the state road, the main road. I mean, these events are huge, but we need to kind of have our finger on them. We need to track these a little bit so that we can sort of see, these patterns that in our landscape, we can tie these back to rainfall events. And then as we look at like 2019 or 2020, you can see that we've had some precip in every month, but it doesn't add up to anything more than 7.36 inches so far. So just knowing where we stand in comparison to a little bit better year can help you make those decisions in regards to stocking rates in a timely fashion. If you're not tracking your rainfall and you're just kind of going off of what the neighbor says we all know that these rainfall events can happen here at your house, and it can be dry by the time you've driven a mile from your house. You can get, an inch in one place and nothing at the other side of the ranch. So having more than one rain gauge would really be ideal. But that's the easiest one, and that's the one that we all really need to be tracking. Let's move forward. And so I don't want to get into the weeds too much about what kinds of grazing management we should all be practicing, because that can get controversial. But I think the important thing that we need to recognize is that our pastures need to rest. We've got to give back to the land if we want to keep receiving. And so we really need to allow our plants to grow taller and our roots to grow deeper at least every once in a while. Those pastures need to rest and allow that to happen, so really that we can replenish the resources that we're using. And the way that works is that, you graze a plant and it grazes here up, but what you have below the soil surface is sort of a reflection of that. So say you have grass here, you're gonna have an equal or so amount of roots below. And when you graze up here, you're shedding roots below. And what that's doing is that's feeding the microbial life below the surface. And those are just as important of grazers as your cattle or your goats or sheep are. And in addition to, having that taller growth, it's really going to affect the microclimate, and you're going to, if you can imagine, you've got grass sticking up and the wind's coming by, you're going to slow down the wind. The soil surface is not going to experience as much wind if you've got grass above it, because it's kind of taking that hit. And also it's going to slow down the water as well. And if you think about the way snow blows across Mexico, as it loves to do, you're going to catch more snow where you have taller grass, and that snow is going to melt, and it's going to hopefully infiltrate your soil. So it's just really important to give your pastures a chance to experience that height, and really just give back. And one way that we can know that we're doing this is to put up grazing exclosures. They don't need to be big. 4 feet by 4 feet or so would do it. And you put the grazing exclosure up, a couple fence posts, and we'll show some pictures here in a second, and then let it be. You come back and look at it and say, well, there's more grass in there, or there's not more grass in there, whatever the case may be. But it's going to tell you a really important story about your influence and your activities on the land. And yeah, it doesn't, we're not going to see the effect of wildlife necessarily with an exclosure, because they're not going to be able to graze in that exclosure. But it's still going to give you an idea of what the impact of your grazing is. There's just nothing more important than getting that forage allocation right. We really need to, the old saying, take half, leave half. Well, that wasn't necessarily taken into consideration. Microbial life and litter on the surface of the soil, and the wildlife, and the fact that you're going to maybe hit a drought, so you need to leave more than half. That we really need to stop thinking of our grazing management that way, and start to think about how much one animal unit consumes, one 1,000-pound animal. How much does that cow really graze? And, our cows are bigger than they used to be. My dad loves to remind, I think he's probably listening, but he loves to remind me that, the cows are a lot bigger than maybe they were 1,000 pounds 20 years ago, but maybe now they're more like 1,200 pounds. And you've been thinking that they're going to consume 30 to 33 pounds a day of forage, but they're bigger and they're going to eat a little bit more. And that adds up over however many animals you have. So we need to be thinking about that and considering that. And just considering, how much do we really need to take? And if we leave more grass, we will have more litter. And the way that litter helps, it will, you're going to have some standing dead vegetation after the growing season. And if you leave it there and you don't graze it, it's not always going to work its way down onto the soil surface. But like we talked about, it'll catch some dust, and it'll catch some snow blowing and stuff. But eventually that litter is going to somehow work its way onto the soil surface. And we need more of that there, because that litter is going to intercept the sunlight. And so you think about a patch of bare ground and you put your hand on it, how hot it is. And then you put your hand over on the grass plant beside it, and it's however many degrees cooler. When you allow that bare ground to just be exposed like that, essentially it gets so hot that you're killing off the microbial activity at the very surface and even down in. And then when water hits it, you're going to get that impact of a raindrop is going to compress that soil surface a little bit and even start to bounce off. Now we've got a hydrophobic soil surface. So that water is going to hit that surface, and then it's going to go laterally until it hits its first plant or something. And if you're on too much of a slope and you've got too much connectivity of your bare ground, we're looking at sheet flow and we're looking at loss of soil. So we need to really we need to manage for more litter. We need to manage for taller grass so that we have that litter, so that we can infiltrate more water. Because if water lands on the litter, it's more likely to go down and in and to soak in. It's dispersing that impact. And so with that, you can increase your organic matter. You're going to store more in that surface layer. I think it's something like 20 to 24,000 gallons per acre per 1% of soil organic matter increase. That's a lot. I mean, talk about drought proofing your ranch a little bit. That's going to make a big difference. We're going to be in drought. That's going to happen. We know that. And there are things we can do to be in drought less of the time, just because we're doing a better job managing our resources. So I don't love showing this because I'm in my 3rd year of drought, and I am also leasing the part of the ranch that has little infrastructure. I've got mostly windmills and huge pastures. Just broke up one that was like 5,000 acres. So my grazing distribution is not great. But here it is. Here's a cage. You can see on the lower part, there's a cage there, a couple fence posts and some cattle panel. We just started establishing this year with some of these cages that were up with NMSU came, and we put up a bunch more. And you can see, so here's spring 2020. You can look down into the cage and across. Those are important photos to have, to that looking down. And then you can see below in fall 2020, we actually went in and clipped these plots. So we clipped, you can see on the far right, there's like a circle there that's a certain size. You just need to know the size. It doesn't have to be necessarily what NRCS does or anything. It just needs to work for you. I think I put this together with some little pieces of pipe that I had. But we clipped that, which means we cut that at the forage at the soil surface. And we got wise. At first, we clipped all the forage and the grass and put it in one bag and took that back. You know, with the clipping and weighing, you dry it and then you weigh it, and then you can kind of extrapolate out to acreage in terms of pounds per acre. Well, we messed up, as you can see on this slide. We included that fall 2020 1,506 pounds. I'm showing this because I want you guys to understand that it's okay to make mistakes. You don't need to get this right away. You just need to keep improving. So this is one of the first ones we did. We clipped it. Comes out to 1,506 pounds, 20 ADAs. That's like, as Katie told us, you know, that's probably more like what you would see in a sub-irrigated place. And what happened was we left the purslane in, and it didn't dry completely because we didn't dry these samples in the microwave. We let them dry in the truck or something for a couple weeks probably. And so when you look over to the right, when we clip outside of the cage, basically you're subtracting 405 pounds from 1,506 pounds, and you do some math there, it comes out to 71% utilization. So you might in your first tries not get this completely right. But as we go back, you can see this is going to help you figure out utilization. In this case, there was more forage outside of the cage than inside of the cage. So what we're probably looking at is, you know, not the grazing wasn't so much the problem that this year, so much as lack of rainfall. These aren't perfect numbers, but these are just some things you can do to kind of get an idea of what you're doing on the landscape with your grazing. And sort of also you have an established photo point, so you can see over time, even just from 2019 in the summer to the fall of 2020, you can see mass die-off of the snakeweed. That's just sort of an extra benefit to doing this sort of method of monitoring your utilization. Great, yes, I'll just quickly say that groundwater should be included in your succession plan. Consider the water in your wells, both recharging and not, as an asset that you would like to pass on to your descendants, just like the land or the cattle, because the land is not worth as much without the water, both monetarily and culturally. We all know that. We know that once you don't have water in an area, that you can't have a community, you can't have livestock, you can't have anything. And you can haul water in, but it's not going to be nearly as profitable or sustainable. So Kate's talking about going around and turning your wells off when your cattle aren't in a pasture. That's going to be cheaper than having to go back later on and haul water in on a daily basis. So that one trip might save you some work later, if in fact you can slow down that usage of your water and that waste of your water. We need to implement water efficient systems that really increase our soil infiltration. I'm sorry, I think that's a typo in there. We need to increase our water efficiency, and we need to install timers on our wells and things like that. In fact, those timers actually will help your wells pump better because they're not constantly pumping. You put a pump, like a solar pump in, it's going to pump consistently when there's sunlight. If you put a timer in, you're going to pump for a little while, shut off. You're going to get hopefully some recharge in that well, slow or not, and then it's going to turn back on, and then it's going to turn off, and you're going to a little bit of recharge. So that's a little bit easier than having your well just pumping all the time, especially when you're compared to a windmill, which sometimes over pumps and sometimes under pumps. Teaching your children these regenerative practices, like teaching a man to fish, this needs to be something that you are focusing on with your kids when they're there on the ranch, or your apprentices, or whoever it is in the next generation that might be coming up to take part in agriculture. And how much value do you really place on your lifestyle? Would you like future generations to experience the same everyday joys and rewards of working with land and livestock or farming? We've got to really think about conserving water so that it's there for the next generations to use. If we are just being sort of complacent about what we have and just running it out on the ground or whatever, that might not be an opportunity that's going to be there for your grandchildren. So we just need to consider that as part of succession planning. And then to get into our final thoughts, we are going to see, if we can increase the amount of water that's infiltrating, we're going to see increased forage. We're going to see increased moisture retention. We're going to see decreased erosion just because we're protecting the soil surface from being washed away. And as Kate put in here, there's a note of caution that if you start to improve your water infiltration and produce more forage, that you got to be talking rates, because then you might need to consider the fact that groundwater might really be your limiting factor rather than your forage. And you just need to pay attention to this. And that's why it's great to have Kate come out and measure wells and sort of measure the depth to the water in your well consistently, to know if these wells are dropping, or if they're increasing, or if they're coasting, or what. Because water doesn't observe political boundaries or fence lines. And it's time to dig into this and kind of figure out what's going on, because we've kind of been ignoring it. We need to pay more attention now that we have this info, and it's overwhelming. I know it's overwhelming, but it's so important. And we just need to continue building the partnerships that allow us to better understand what's going on with our land and take care of it, take care of the land and the water, and the land and the water will take care of you. And I think that I would like to throw in also that soil health is not something that the elite or the well-funded can achieve. And often when producers demonstrate their management in a presentation, the focus is on areas where they've already succeeded. We often see the photos of the best locations on someone's ranch in a good rainfall year.
I was about to.
What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. But we don't see the places that are still not healed, and even after years of trying. And so there's no magic overnight remedy, but there are some practices that we can do for free, and we need to work to do that. We need to demonstrate better that it's okay to be in the process of improving. That's okay, and that we don't expect producers to get it right away. We as land managers just need a safe space to share these ideas, and we need to stop judging each other. And every economic situation is different for every ranch. This is not a competition, because we all lose equally if we don't, each one of us, start to improve the health of our watersheds. So let's take the ego out of land management and let's start to work together. And there is no one right person or idea. We have got to combine the deep knowledge of a particular piece of land that a producer holds with the deep knowledge of the processes at work, ecological, social, economic, that those in supportive roles hold. It's got to be a teamwork. There should be no one direction for the flow of information. And we know now that the food chain is really a web, and that is not different from how we need to see each of our roles in the pursuit of land health. And with that, Kate, do you have anything else?
No, do you just want to move on to our partnership slide so we can acknowledge some of the other folks who let me run amok on their ranches?
Yes, and I'll just point out in that photo there, we're looking at an old plow on the very edge of a field. You can kind of see on the right-hand side is the field, and on the left was unplowed. And it's great because you've got a juniper there and you've got some cholla, and this is really a great picture of what's going on in the West, I would say. And here are acknowledgements. We've got lots and lots of help. Kate and I are working with the High Plains Grasslands Alliance a lot. I serve on the board of Southwest Grass-Fed Livestock Alliance, and she's in all kinds of things, and there's lots of producers that are really contributing to this story and this process. Any questions?
So we want to thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Kate and Emily. We learned so much from what you've told us, and Kate, how complex it is below the soil surface, and Emily, some really wise management ideas, and as well as amazing resources. And I just wanted to say, in terms of those resources, Amy Ganguly, well, Isabel and Eva Stricker commented that there are ways that we can help make better sense of those links. And Quivira has a kind of a watch party for some. Amy has a link in the questions that you can go to for more information on the land PKS. And Isabel will coordinate with Emily and Kate to get links to everybody on the call for all these resources. And we want to just, I know we only have 6 minutes or so. We want to give folks a chance for questions, and people are thanking you so much for the presentation, as you can see in the chat. And if anyone wants to ask a question, they should do so in the chat. And so Brad Holian, if you want to unmute and ask your question, please do so.
How anal should we be in removing some of the small invasive plants in meadows if they are actually doing something, maybe not much, but something to protect from the soil from wind, and they're gathering snow or rain? I mean, you know, do we just say, well, we'll take out anything that's taller than 5 feet, or you know, we only have a few of them in a meadow? Should we you know, just get a chainsaw and take out a few, or what? How important is getting some of the good effects from those invasive plants?
So at least sort of one thing that I would maybe suggest doing is, for your ranch itself, is to go through the ecological site profiles to understand what's going to be best for your landscape. It's probably, and again, I'm a geologist, so take this with a grain of salt. I think there's that balance, right? You do want some of that wind protection, but if you get a whole bunch of juniper that are starting to interlock with one another, they're not actually probably going to let a lot of that snow get all the way down to the ground. So trying to figure out that balance is going to be tricky. But you know, maybe don't go whole scale apocalyptic on everything, but find that balance that's going to work for surface exposure, windbreak, wildlife that may want to have clusters of trees to hang out in. I think there's quite a bit of literature about those aspects, but it's figuring out for you specifically what helps you to see the best benefit for your land. Emily, you're way better at this than me.
Well, we just finished up like 360 acres of brush control, and it's expensive. I think that, like she said, looking at the ecological site description and kind of determining, was this an area that should have juniper? That's a big one, because they're doing something for us in the rocky areas in terms of soil building and just stabilizing. But in those areas with deeper soils, I think the cheapest way to handle juniper is to lop it when it's still little, and you know that they're still small. That's very labor intensive, but it's going to be far cheaper than trying to remove it with a skid steer or something later on. So you need a young buck, a young apprentice or something for that.
Thank you for those responses to that really great question. And just so you know, there's so many people that are saying thank you for what a great information that you've shared. I just want to acknowledge that. And I did know that Isabel has a question for you, so I want to let her ask that.
I wanted to just comment on something you said towards the end, Emily, about sharing and working together, and how important that is. And you are actually one of our newest and also youngest soil health champions here in New Mexico. And I would love for you to just explain that concept and just mention that, tell people a little bit about that.
That is about being a soil health champion. Well, I gave a presentation back at Edible in January, and I was approached by someone and said, "Hey, we want you to be a soil health champion." And it's a very easy process to get involved with them, and really it's an opportunity to learn from others. There's like I think it's a monthly sort of webinar meeting where you get on and kind of share some ideas and work directly with this New Mexico Healthy Soils Working Group. You get these opportunities to learn and also share. And I think that as we are looking to the future for how we're going to manage climate change and how we're going to manage drought and all these problems, it's an opportunity to really work together. And I think it's important to be that advocate, whether it's uncomfortable or not, or whether you have it all figured out already. I don't think that's necessarily the point. I think it's just good to facilitate that in each other and on different properties, and talk to your neighbors. And that's another way that I think is the biggest way that producers work together, is through chatting with their neighbors at the branding table, shipping table, whatever it is, while you're gathering cattle. And championing can be all sorts of different ways to do that. So
that's amazing. Thank you so much for that insight. And we hope that many of you on the call will join, on the webinar, will join the Healthy Soil Champions. It's a work in progress. You don't have to be completely there yet, an expert. It's ongoing. So on that note, I want to say goodbye to everybody and thank you for participating. It means a lot to everybody.
Thank you for the opportunity.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you guys for showing up, all of the audience.
Yeah. From
Wherever
Texas.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kate. Thanks,
Thank
Emily.
you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Isabel.